This is the Internet Privacy Amendment. Mr. Chairman, in 2002, 5 years before the Apple iPhone was first introduced to the world, Minnesota passed a statute that provided a modicum of privacy for consumers who access the Internet. It's been 15 years since that statute was enacted, and it has not been updated once. It addresses Internet service providers, but it does not even address telecommunications service providers. It does not provide for any prohibitions on pricing differentials or on blocking access entirely to the Internet if someone refused to give authorization for the Internet company to access, collect, and sell to the highest bidder their personal information. It gave deference to federal law, deference which would allow any federal law addressing the topic to override state law, even if it was not deemed to be preemptive under federal statute and the Constitution. And it contained very little specificity about what personally identifiable information was. So, Mr. Chairman, it's time to update that language. Right now, Minnesota's private, personally identifiable information when they access the Internet, from every keystroke to every website that they visit, every place they browse, all the information that they download, all of their buying habits, all of that is at risk of being collected and sold by the Internet service provider or a telecommunications service provider. We have an opportunity, in fact, we've had an opportunity for the last 2 months since similar language was adopted by both bodies of this legislature to have substantial hearings in the legislature on the topic, to vet it, to look for unintended consequences of proposed language, to take input from stakeholders and from the public. Yet this legislature has not done so. There are many other issues that have come up in that time where special committee hearings were held, where even as recently as yesterday, the day before adjournment, a different Senate committee was convened to hear legislation that had not been heard yet in the Senate. So it strikes me as rather odd that there was not a sense of urgency about this, which admittedly was introduced late in terms of our deadlines, but still 2 months ago, and the day after the federal government removed the potential for these protections from regulations that were going to take effect. Mr. Chairman, the 812 amendment would clarify and expand the definition of consumer. It would provide a definition of express approval, a mechanism by which a consumer would have the opportunity to provide explicit authorization or to decline to provide explicit authorization for their data to be collected and sold. It expands the definition of personally identifiable information to include name, date of birth, social security number, consumer's spouse or children, browsing cache, cookies, history of a consumer, including the content on an Internet site viewed by the consumer, the Internet protocol address associated with the electronic device that belongs to the consumer, consumer's occupation, credit history, financial account information, medical history, political party affiliation, disability or other protected status, physical location of the consumer at any time, and the ability to identify or create a profile of a person by aggregating personal information. None of that information is currently listed in the existing 15-year-old statute. Some of the other provisions in current statute are updated simply by adding telecommunications service provider next to the language for an Internet service provider. I already noted the prohibition on a service provider, either ISP or telecom, from refusing to provide service to or charging a higher rate or somehow other penalizing or discriminating against a customer because they refuse to provide the authorization that that company seeks for their purposes of their own profit. It updates the civil damages amount, and it deletes the deference to federal law provision as well. I know that the legislature supports this because the House voted unanimously to adopt an even broader language than this, and the Senate voted with only one objection, 66-1, to adopt language not unlike this in its essence. And that one objector has since publicly declared his support for protecting Internet privacy and indeed introduced a bill that was very similar to the original amendment that I offered and was adopted by the Senate to the jobs bill. So I think it's fair to say that the legislature unanimously supports this, and I think it's also fair to say that the public is very strongly behind the legislature on this, in support of the legislature's position. I can tell you that I have people who I don't know approaching me in grocery stores thanking me for protecting their privacy on the Internet. I've never had that level of public engagement on a particular issue. So this has indeed gained traction among the general public, and I think this legislature would be remiss if it did not recognize that significance, and if we were to delay addressing this topic until next year, it would be a major failure on the part of this legislature. Now, I will tell you, members, I have tried 2 times before this to get the attention of certain bodies in this legislature to address this now. I had arranged for this amendment to be offered as a part of the separately tracking small cell wireless bill in the Senate, and the committee rejected that opportunity on a partisan vote, straight partisan vote, by the way. The Jobs Conference Committee similarly rejected this amendment in the last day, also, unfortunately, on a straight partisan vote. I do not seek to make this a partisan issue. It's not a partisan issue, and it ought not to be a partisan issue. But I'm very, very disappointed that this legislature has not even had enough concern to hold a separate hearing on the topic. Even this conference committee had enough concern about all sorts of House provisions that came in, the policy provisions that came in the omnibus budget bill, to go through and hear full-blown testimony on those topics. And I say that not as a criticism of this committee, because this bill was not in front of this committee. It was a Jobs and Economic Development, Energy and Telecommunications provision. But to illustrate that this legislature was fully capable in the last 2 months of having full hearings capable of vetting these proposals, drafting up language. In the conference committee where it resided, or where it was where it disappeared from in the middle of the night, couldn't even be bothered to have a public discussion on the topic, let alone take public testimony and evaluate the language. So, members, I think we really need to address this issue this year, and that's why I've placed this amendment before the committee for discussion.